Before we crack on with the video, I just wanted to let you know that iDRIVEACLASSIC is sponsored by Adrian Flux. I've also got all my cars insured with them, and I also have Flux Rescue, because guess what? All my cars do break down, even if I pretend they don't. If you haven't got your car insured yet, or you're looking for a new renewal quote, click the link below and get in touch with the Adrian Flux team. Hi guys, it's Steph from iDRIVEACLASSIC, and on this very unseasonably sunny day in February, we're looking at this Armstrong Siddeley Lancaster from 1949. In the video today, I'm going to take you for a walk around the outside of the car, we're going to look inside, and we're even going to take her out on a test drive. And whilst we're out today, I'm going to tell you about the history of the car, because you may never have seen one of these before. Just over 3,500 were made, and they've not been made since the 50s. So let's go and discover a real classic, and I'll tell you all about it as we go along. The Lancaster is a rare breed in 2022 and wasn't a massive seller at time of launch. The car came to market in 1945 and just over 3,500 cars were made. The car was announced just before the end of the war in May 1945, at a time where companies had just begun to funnel efforts into post-war manufacturing, and the Lancaster was one of the first post-war cars to be announced. Although the car was launched in 1945, the first cars weren't delivered in until 1946, and production ceased in 1952. It is also worth noting that around this time there were metal shortages and lots of cars were being exported, so it was a very different climate to, say, 10 years later, which might also explain why production volumes were so small. The Lancaster was named after the famous World War II aircraft, and along with the Hurricane, created a lot of excitement for what was to come in the world of automotive post-war. The body was produced for Armstrong Siddeley by Mulliners of Birmingham. Despite being a post-war car, the Armstrong Siddeley, like many businesses, had focused their efforts elsewhere during wartime, because of course at this time they're creating weapons, they're creating aircraft, machinery, and everything for the war effort. So whilst the car itself was new, the engine and the transmission unit from the pre-war 16 horsepower saloons was very much used alongside a Stromberg carb. So really at this point in the automotive world, you don't expect too many changes. Although Armstrong Siddeley were never ones to rest on their laurels, so even though the car was only produced for a very short period of time, there were lots of changes made throughout production. And this included a change in 1949 when the car was available with an 18 horsepower engine. Although this particular car that we're testing today is the 16 horsepower variant. Another interesting fact on this car is, aside from a handful of Whitleys, the Lancaster was the only car of the 16 to 18 horsepower range to feature a sunshine roof. Aside from the engine and interesting post-war automotive information, for me, the best thing on this car and the thing that really got me excited was the Wilson Pre-selector box, which provides transmission for the car. Now, the Wilson Pre-selector box was a really big deal, and it was a pre-war invention, and at the time of launch was hailed as the most revolutionary device since the introduction of the motor car. Now, if you think about it, when we talked about things like the Austin 7, we talked about pre-synchro boxes where you've got crash boxes and you're having to match revs, and if you don't get it quite right, it can be very difficult. This is a lot easier. It allowed gear changes to be implemented with utmost speed and with minimal risk of miscalculation, damage or noise. And in a world of crash boxes, it meant that there was something new for the driver that was far easier and far smoother than ever before. Now, if you're wondering what a pre-selector box is, because I certainly did, we're going to demo it when we go for a drive. But to give you a bit of information before we demo it, what you do is you choose your preferred gear without touching the clutch pedal like you might do in your modern car. And then once you're ready to proceed into your preferred gear, you fully depress the clutch and then release it. Now, once you've fully released that clutch, that then puts the car into that gear. So it's actually very interesting, and you'll see when we go driving that once you've done it a couple of times, it's a lot easier than you think. So it does sound a bit of a faff, but trust me, it's easy once we get going. Now before we go for a drive, I wanted to introduce the owner, John. John's been on the channel before, he owns the Protons, and he's one of the youngest Armstrong owners in the UK. Oh, and one last thing before I hand over to John. You probably noticed that Sphinx on the bonnet of the car and thought, why is that there? Well, it's because when Armstrong Siddeley was selling cars at this time, they sold them with the strapline as silent as the Sphinx. Henceforth, every car had a Sphinx on the bonnet. Now back over to you, John.
Hi, I'm John Coupland, and I'm going to tell you why I've bought this car whilst taking it for a drive. So I have a bad habit, and it gets me in trouble in that I often get bored, and when I get bored I'm searching Car and Classic, and it's deadly, isn't it? You see lots of things that you think you might like and might want. So I saw this for sale last February. It was cold, it was snowy, we were in the middle of lockdown, and yeah, I had it searched for Armstrong Siddeley on the Car and Classic, and this came up for sale. I must admit, at first I thought this is an offer that's too good to be true, and so I rang the gentleman that had it for sale. He explained that he'd bought it as a bit of a project during lockdown from a dealer, and he was now getting too old to get in and out of it because it is a little bit of a beast to drive, and so I bought it sight unseen. Silly idea or not, who knows. But my grandfather always had an Armstrong Siddeley Lancaster, and my mum always told me about it and said, it was the sort of car that your granddad had when I was a kid. And so I decided to buy one, and be that a good idea or not, I've ended up with one, and it's actually my favourite car out of my whole collection to just take out high days and holidays, just to go for a nice drive.
Oh, it's a real, do you know what? It's a real privilege doing videos sometimes, because there's stuff like this that I would never in my wildest dreams ever get to see unless people were really generous and handed the keys over. Because I don't think I've ever seen a Lancaster anywhere, not in a museum, not at a show. And I mean, there were only just over 3,500 made and not many survive. But what a privilege it is. Now, as you probably noticed on the outside, it has benefited from an older restoration. I briefly mentioned that as we walked round, and it's starting to weather slightly because it did get restored in the 70s, and it's had a bit of a touch up on the inside as well because, as you probably noticed, the interior isn't correct. And I'm a bit of a purist, so try and keep it under wraps because purists do get a bad name for themselves. And that's probably the only thing that I don't like about this car is that, and I don't know why they've done it, but a dealer in the last 20 years has had this car go through and they've re-trimmed it in vinyl. And I know that a trim is not cheap. I know that it's not cheap. It's really hard to even find a trimmer at the moment. But to re-trim it in vinyl, I feel it's really taken away from some of the specialness of the car, because when you get into something like this, you should be able to smell the leather the minute you open the door, and the way that it creaks and just everything about it. And instead I get in, the car doesn't really smell of anything, and it's actually very quiet getting in. I don't know, maybe I'm being silly, but for me that's the only thing that really detracts from the specialness of the car. Now, we talked about when we were doing walk round how it wasn't just any old car, they were quite a luxury build. And even when you do things like open this glove box, which by the way has got everything inside, and you shut it again, we push the button in, it has a real quality shut to it. It doesn't feel tinny, and that's the lovely thing about cars from this era, is when you take them out, you always have a nice time because they're always well built. They always have so many lovely little bits and pieces about them. And they're just really special. And they're also deliciously simple as well. Because, I mean, we haven't actually got that much going on. We've got our wipers here. We've got a heater fan here. Which, by the way, I know a lot of you at home are going to think is like a mouse's dying breath. But it's actually quite warm. We haven't got it on today because it's actually quite warm, despite the fact it's the end of February. So we'll be leaving that off. Coming down from there, we've got this aftermarket panel. What do I think of it? It's purely functional, isn't it? It's doing its job. So we've got a clock in there, you've got a cigar lighter, and those two flashing lights either side are, if you're eagle-eyed, you'll notice that this is on of course, trafficators and semaphores from new, but somebody very cleverly, and in my opinion, has made an intelligent choice, has put normal indicators as well, front and rear. Now, I think that's quite good because a lot of drivers nowadays wouldn't know what semaphores did, and they'd be like, oh, you're not indicating, and it just takes away some of the stress of driving. Coming in front of us, we've got 3 Smiths gauges, we've got petrol, we've got a speedo, and we've got the oil pressure there. If you're wondering what the top speed is that John's had it up to, it's around 60 miles per hour. We won't be doing that today. On the steering wheel here, we've got the horn. Quality horn, sounds good. Got the indicators there, or trafficators, semaphores, and then down here, this is for our main beam. And that's kind of everything in a nutshell in front of us. And something that I quite like, and I feel is very prevalent running through this car, is there's almost that hint of Art Deco-ness. Now, I don't know if you've spotted that ashtray in the back, but even that feels like one of those lamps that you see on like a wall. It feels very special. Now, coming to our right-hand side here, we've got the additional panel. So you've got your panel light button. I mean, can you believe that people thought that panel lights were distracting when you've got these giant, horrible screens in the middle of cars that you've got now? You've got your push start there, because to start it, we have to turn the key and push the button. You've got your petrol there, and you'll see it says M and R. The M is for main, the R is for reserve tank. No, we don't know how much is in the reserve tank, and John's never found out. You've got your lamps there, so that's your headlights, so that's side and headlight. And that is pretty much it in a nutshell, apart from 2 other key details that you might blink and miss. So first of all, you've got these little, I'm trying to think what we call them. We call them levers. And you pull them, and these little side flaps open so you get extra ventilation. And we've got the sunshine roof up here. Now, unfortunately, because that's on a wooden frame and it's a little bit sticky, we're not going to open that today. I mean, I'm sure we could rag it open if we wanted to, but we're not going to, because respecting older cars is what it's all about. So that's all of that, and that's all very simple and straightforward. And then, of course, we've got the Wilson Pre-selector gearbox, and we talked a little bit about this on the walk round, and I said I'd show you. So what you do is, very quickly to explain before we go for a drive, and I demonstrate it for you, is as we're driving along and we feel we're ready to go into the next gear, we move up into that gear. We then put our foot on the clutch, as you would, standard, and then what happens is the car then comes up into that gear. Have I tried it yet? Absolutely not. Have I ever experienced this before? Also not. But we're going to find out exactly what it's like when we take it out for a drive, and I'll be honest with you. So I think it's time we get us started up, and I'll let you hear that engine. Now, usually we would pull the choke out and we wouldn't be revving straight away, but we've already moved her a couple of times round John's garden, so he said it's just fine, you don't need the choke. So I think she sounds very healthy for an older lady. Now I'll let you have a listen from the outside, and then we're going to bring the car around the front and we're going to take her out for a drive. Right, I'm going to show you how this is done. I've had a couple of little practice runs. It's a really different concept to drive, this pre-selector box. But essentially it is what it says on the tin. We pre-select the gear, and then we put the clutch in, release the clutch, and then we set off, and that selects the gear. So what we do is we first of all choose our intended gear. Now we won't pick the first gear, because first gear is for when you're going up a really steep hill or you're crawling really slowly. So we're going to go straight up into second. So we're going to just check. Yep, we're all good. So what we're going to do is select second. Now usually you'd start going, wouldn't you? But what we have to do is we have to put our foot down on the clutch and release it. Trafficator on, and we crack on. And that's third gear. And that's fourth. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how well she stops up, because, and I was barely touching the brake there, a lot of people think that when you get an older stuff like this, that the brakes are bad, that they're all slow. And you know what? For round town, she's not a bad bet. Now because I'm coming down to a junction, I'm selecting second there, straight in. We're in second. So as you see, once you get used to it, it becomes second nature. It's actually quite easy to do. Love how I said that as the clutch stuck. I think the weirdest thing about driving this is you have to get out of the mindset that, you know, when you go to select a gear, normally you would put your foot down as you go into the gear. You have to get your head out of that game and get into thinking, right, select the gear and then do the foot movement, so they're not conjoined. It's you almost have to retrain your brain. And as you can see, the handling is a bit, so I think we're on steering box on this, and it's a bit I'm going to use John's word, it's a bit wavy, but it's, for the age of the car, it's very it's very usual is what I'd say. I don't think it's far off what you'd expect. But you know what, you get in Morris Minors and it's not exactly like your handling is amazing, is it? You get used to it, you accommodate and adapt your driving to the car. And once you get into it and you get into that pre-selector box, you can put your foot down like we are now. And I mean, we're getting up to the heady highs now of about 37 miles per hour. So it feels a little bit less sprightly than, do you remember the standard cars that we took out? I felt like they were had a little bit more oomph in them. But she's a lovely old girl to drive. I think this isn't a car that you would be doing something like motorway driving on or anything like that. But for a sedate Sunday drive, going to car shows, going to the pub, she's a lovely option. And I think, you know, now that so many of us work from home after lockdown, those of us that can, I certainly don't, having a classic car like this that you can enjoy on high days and holidays, it becomes more of an option because you are doing some of these smaller journeys. And I think that something that I really like about cars of this age is that you can buy into a relatively good example at quite a low cost, because people just don't think that cars of this age are any fun, or they think they're too old. Now, something that I really like about these Armstrong Siddeley's is the Owners Club has recognised the need for support, for help, and on their website they have all these different informations and tech packs, so you can just go on their website and find out everything you need to find out. So the support is there if you buy into something like this. And to be honest, a lot of these older cars, the Owners Clubs are hugely supportive, and they are a mine of information that you can tap into for bits. And you've got plenty of people that can remanufacture bits, repurpose bits. So buying something like this is actually a viable choice, much more than people think, I think. Now it's almost time for me to hand back the keys. It feels like it's been a very short test drive today. But what is good about it and what isn't? So first of all, if you've never driven an older car, and some of you haven't, the handling is probably well off the mark. You would have to get used to it. The pre-selector box is remarkably easy. I was quite frightened of it when I first got in, and I'm not frightened to tell you all that. I was really nervous about using it, and I got my head into the game very, very quickly. I don't like the seating position. Now, I know I'm not slimmer the year yet. I'm working on it, but not yet. So I feel like I'm really close to the steering wheel because I'm very short and the pedals seem really far into the footwell. So I've had to bring the seat as far forward as you can come. So if you're shorter than me and I'm 5'3", you probably don't have much hope of reaching those pedals. But apart from that, it's a jolly little car. It looks very nice from the outside. It's very comfortable. You could easily pile all your friends in it and have a great time. It would fit into, I would say it would fit into most size garages, so it's a viable option to keep for a Sunday car. And you've got a supportive owners club, so really it's not a completely unattractive prospect. Armstrong Siddeley's aren't the most expensive cars, the most expensive mark to buy into, but you still get that lovely drive, that 40s driving experience that so many of us should experience, because 50s and 60s cars are great, and They're really expensive to buy into at the moment, but stuff like this is just as good, and sometimes you get a much richer experience. So it's time for me to hand back the keys. It's been lovely to take you all out today. But until next Sunday, when we look at something completely different, take care and drive safely.